All right, we are live. How you guys doing?
Fine.
All
Doing
right.
amazing.
Awesome. Okay, Michael, you were going to start it off. Go ahead.
Sure. Well, maybe do you want to do a quick introductions so that we
Um,
know who's here?
yeah, how about you guys introduce yourselves?
Cool. My name's Michael. I live in Canada. Today we're going to be discussing. So basically, I stumbled across one of Jackie's videos, and it was responding to can't remember the guy's name, but some
Derek,
Derek.
Simnet Nutrition.
Yeah, cool. So I've like watched a couple of his videos on like recipes and stuff, so I recognized him, and you had him in the thumbnail, so I clicked on the video, watched it. You had some criticisms of, I think he was responding to like common misconceptions of veganism or something. Led me down a bit of a rabbit hole. I watched some of your content to get sort of a sense of your position. I think we are coming from two different worldviews as far as like ethics, impact on environment, as well as nutrition. I'd love to talk about all these things with you. We only have about an hour today, so I think we're going to focus on nutrition, and we can, if this goes well, happy to chat again. But yeah, I'm a vegan, ethically and by diet, and so I eat a 100% plant-based diet. Occasionally, I will eat bivalve, so I guess that's technically an animal. But yeah, Jackie, I don't know if you want to do a quick intro for yourself.
Yeah, my name is Jackie, and I have a YouTube channel called Forever for Never Vegan. And basically, on the channel, I post short videos explaining my position, like regarding veganism and some of the arguments that vegans make. And sorry, give me 2 seconds. And then sometimes I'll post reviews, or not reviews, but like reactions to videos that some vegans put out or their proponents. Just basically trying to ask people to take what they say with a grain of salt and to employ some common sense and critical thinking, so that they don't sort of fall for the, I don't have a nice way of putting it, fall for the things that they say.
Yeah, I love it. I totally am the same way. And I've probably in my life in the past believed a lot of the things that I've sort of just not taken with a grain of salt and believed too quickly before doing my own research. And there's a lot of bad rabbit holes you can go down even when you try to do your own research because, one level in when you're looking at like authorities or influencers, they or health experts, like they all have their own different opinions. And so like my perspective is I really wanted to understand from the bottom up, basically, why or what I should eat and understand kind of the why I should eat that way and for nutrition. So I would approach that from a scientific perspective. I would look at like, what does the evidence show? Would you agree that that's a good place to start is like, what does the evidence show?
Oh, I think you cut out. We weren't able to hear
No,
you.
that's my fault. I muted myself and I didn't unmute myself. I said yes, it's a place to start.
Cool. Would you mind if I just took a few minutes and went through sort of my position and why I believe the things that I do?
Sure.
All right. Cool. Carson, you can share. So I put this together. Jackie, would it be fair to describe your diet as the carnivore diet?
That's basically what it is, yes.
Okay. Cool. So, all right. So we're talking about two kind of diet approaches, vegan or plant-based diet versus carnivore diet, which is healthier. And I think in order to do this, the first question we have to ask is like, what does healthy actually mean? This is sort of how I look at it is we have this, I made this up, this isn't the real thing, but like the food health hierarchy. And at the base of the pyramid is your total energy balance. So basically, if you're not getting enough calories, you're starving, and pretty much any food is healthy. But assuming you're living in the modern world and anyone listening to this debate or discussion or whatever, this is likely not a concern. On the flip side, over consuming calories is one of the worst things that you can do in terms of your health. This is the reason that highly processed foods are quote unquote bad for you. It's that they're hyper palatable, which means they're easy to overconsume, which means that you're going to exceed your energy balance, which has a bunch of downstream effects like causing you to store excess fat. which can lead to heart disease, diabetes, and ultimately death. So base of the pyramid is easy to understand, at least, kind of difficult to execute sometimes, but it's don't starve and don't overeat. And I think that you can do that both on the carnivore and the vegan diet. So I don't think there's any necessarily advantage to the base of the pyramid there. So I'm moving on to macronutrients, the next level of the pyramid. Here we're talking about carbs, fats, and protein. So first off, with carbs, they come in two main categories: complex carbs such as fruits, vegetables, whole grains, nuts, and seeds, and refined carbs such as, cookies, cakes, Coke, whatever. Refined carbs generally lower in fiber, lower in micronutrients, and more palatable, meaning that they're easier to overconsume. So I would be advocating for a vegan diet that would contain mostly complex carbs from the carb source. Just a case in point about the fiber thing, just 4 bananas is about the same in terms of calories as 7 Oreos, but obviously it's way easier to eat 7 Oreos and, think about eating 14 Oreos versus 8 bananas. And this is one of the main reasons that complex carbs are more filling, is that they're rich in fiber. And as we know, fiber is being extremely well researched and points to lower risk of disease and death. This meta-analysis from 2023 found a 22% lower risk of all-cause mortality for people who ate more fiber. So that's carbs. If we look at protein, protein's rich in many plant sources, many animal sources. And when we look at plant versus animal protein, we see that when we replace plant with animal protein, meaning you're taking animal protein out of your diet and putting plant protein in, this funnel plot was based on substituting only 3% of calories, and it resulted in a 3% of calories, and that was a 6% lower risk of all-cause mortality. And this is only 3% of calories. If we,
sorry, did you say 6%? Like 0.6?
6% lower risk of mortality per 3% of calories substituted. So like if we extrapolate that out to like 21% of your calories as protein, which is again even still like maybe in the range, but maybe slightly low, that would lower risk by about 40% by switching all those to plant protein. Next off, we have fats, and there's 4 main types of fats. I didn't even put trans fat on here because I think we can all agree it's extremely unhealthy. But there's saturated fat, mostly found in animal foods. There's polyunsaturated, or PUFAs, which are found in whitefish, some seed oils, nuts, and things like that. And then monounsaturated, or MUFAs, found in things like olive oil, salmon, avocados. So these different fat sources come from different foods. But when we look at these different fats, so this study was a meta-analysis of 395 metabolic ward studies. So not like prospective cohort data, this is actual interventions. And when we replace complex carbs, so the good kind of carbs, with different fat sources, so this top one looks at saturated fat, risk went up. Polyunsaturated fat, risk went down slightly, and then monounsaturated, it was about the same. And if we look at just a quick recap of all the macronutrient categories, for things that lower your risk: fiber, plant protein, poly and monounsaturated fats. Things that raise your risk: refined carbs, animal protein, saturated fat, and trans fat. So climbing up to the next level, micronutrients. So again, to be healthy, you want to make sure that you're not deficient in any essential micronutrients. And pretty much any diet is going to have certain nutrients that are easier to get and others that are more difficult to get. This meta-analysis found that on average, this is the study here, vegans are more likely to be at risk for B12, D, calcium, iodine. The women had a lower or higher risk for iron deficiency and zinc, whereas meat eaters tended to be higher risk of inadequacy for D, E, folate, calcium, and magnesium. So these are trends, of course. You can always modify your diet to account for these nutrients by eating different foods, eating fortified foods like nutritional yeast, for example. A lot of plant milks have a bunch of extra vitamins added, or just taking supplements. It's pretty easy as long as you know what you're looking for. And finally, top of the pyramid, important. Not only do we want to have our diet like meet our energy balance, macro goals, and the micronutrients that we need, we also want to choose a diet that reduces our risk of long-term chronic diseases, letting us live longer and healthier. So what do you know when we look at diet trends? This meta-analysis of over 2.2 million people with a follow-up duration of 36 years found that plant-based diets associated with a 16% lower risk of mortality and 18% lower risk of type 2 diabetes, 12% lower risk of cancer, 10% lower risk of heart disease. And by the way, these went up when they subgrouped by healthy plant diets. So this meta-analysis was just like leaning plant versus leaning not. So people eating Oreos all day would be included in this. What about when we look at meat consumption? Well, unfortunately, we see the opposite. So this study pooled 2 prospective cohort studies with almost 3 million person years of follow-up and found for every 1 serving of unprocessed red meat a day, this resulted in a 13% increased risk in mortality. And then this study here looking specifically at low carb, high fat diets. And basically they compared it against a standard diet and found that they had over double the risk. I can't find where it said that here, but maybe I didn't screenshot the caption, but it was 9.8 versus 4.3 was the risk. And then in this study, pooling 6 prospective cohort studies, this is based on a US population, and it broke meat consumption down by type. So maybe some different meats are better than others as far as risk. And what they saw is that fish had a slightly positive effect. Chicken was better in some and worse in others. But red meat was bad across the board. Obviously, processed meat much worse than unprocessed meat, but they did break that out. And they found that red meat had a 3% higher risk of all-cause mortality and heart disease per 2 servings per week. And so what they did is they extrapolated that out over longer periods of time. And with just 2 servings of red meat per week, they looked at 10, 20, and 30 year. And for 30 year, there was an absolute risk of 76%. So obviously, the longer you eat a diet, the more your risk goes up. Another meta-analysis from 2020, I'm almost done, looking at randomized control trials that lowered dietary saturated fat and looked at heart disease risk. They found that there was a 17% reduction when saturated fat intake was lowered. And they noted that this was a dose dependent, meaning that if you had a bigger reduction in saturated fat, which is obviously meat is very high in saturated fat, this led to even lower risk. And finally, you don't have to take my word for any of this. Here's the European Atherosclerosis Society Consensus Panel, and they published a statement that says LDL, just to paraphrase, LDL unequivocally causes heart disease, and they base this on over 200 papers with over 20 million person years of follow-up. And their criteria for causality is right here. I'm happy to go through it if you want. But yeah, this is very consistent and well-established in nutrition science that we should be eating more plants and less red meat. So there's my cramming some of it into as much as I could. Sorry, I just got muted here. Here we go. Yeah, I'm back. So curious to just hear your response to any of that. And
I'm just curious as to why you think I've never heard any of this information before.
Okay, well, what would be your response to that?
It's information. It's a place to start, but it's not the end all be all. And it doesn't tell me especially what my outcome is going to be, especially as a carnivore. Usually when they're looking at this information, they're basing it off of people who are eating omnivorously. And they're basing it off of people who have been eating that way for basically their entire lives. And so it's not really answerable for me when I'm trying to figure out what my health outcomes are going to be.
So is your position then that you're eating in a way that has not been researched, and so we don't know one way or another
Precisely
what the results are going to be?
Precisely.
Okay. And why would you assume that if So all the data that I showed, it showed that the more red meat and the more saturated fat you eat, the worse the outcomes.
It showed it's possible.
Dose-dependent
It
response.
showed it was possible. Yes.
What do you mean by possible? What do you mean?
Possible means it may or may not happen.
Well, we're talking about risk. So yeah, of course it's possible. But would you want a diet that has higher risk or lower risk of
I'd want a
chronic heart disease?
diet. I would want a diet that I could feel certain was actually providing me good health outcomes as opposed to negative health outcomes.
Well, you just said there's no research and you're kind of going off of a diet that hasn't been studied. So if you wanted certainty, why wouldn't you go with diets that are well established to lower your risk of these chronic diseases?
How long has the vegan diet been around?
I'm not sure.
Okay. Well, how long have people been eating meat compared to any possible vegan diet that a person could have had in our entire history on this planet?
You're talking like ancestrally, like way, like
sure, yeah, maybe even just the past. I don't know how many, a few decades, even like less than a century, like we're talking about, compared to our entire history since we started eating meat on the planet.
We have data going back much longer than a couple of decades.
For veganism?
Yeah.
For not veganism, sorry. Very specifically a vegan diet.
For plant-based diets, absolutely.
Okay, so I'm talking about veganism. I'm not talking about a plant-based diet. That's a useless conversation.
Well, it's the same. Yeah. So by plant, I mean, 100% or very near plant-based diets. Looking at like Adventist Health Study 2, Women's Health Initiative.
Adventist Health. Okay. Sorry.
You said, is there research going back more than a decade or two? And I'm just saying, yes, we have studied vegan populations, vegetarian populations.
No. I don't think that's what I meant to say. If that's what I said, I take it back.
Okay. Sorry, what did you mean to say?
It's my contention that we have crap for evidence of what is supposed to be anybody's outcome when it comes to any diet, let alone a vegan diet or a carnivore diet. But
what did you think about all the evidence I just presented that shows that the more plants you eat, the more fiber you eat, the lower your risk, the more saturated fat, the more red you eat, the higher your risk, the more red meat you eat, the higher your risk?
The same as I said before we began, or whenever it was, that it's information that's a good place to start.
Okay. And so how would you modify your, like, what else would modify your opinion on that information?
I mean, I don't know real life outcomes.
Do you think that studies are not real life outcomes?
I do think that they're not real life outcomes because they didn't do any experiments.
What do you mean they didn't do experiments?
They didn't do experiments, Michael. That's what I mean. It's exactly what I just said.
What do you mean by experiments? Sorry, what do you mean by experiments?
If you want, okay, how long does it take a human being to develop heart disease? Just ballpark.
The risk develops. The risk can be seen as quickly as like 6 to 8 years, but the long-term risk, where the bigger risk impact comes, is much longer. So like the longer you live a certain way, the higher the risk.
And so for the people in any of the studies that you showed related to heart disease, how long were those people locked in a lab and having their diets controlled and their entire lives controlled so that we would know precisely what was directly impacting the health outcomes of those particular people?
Sure. So the Hooper meta-analysis, which I listed in the references, was looking at randomized controlled trials where they substituted saturated fat for.
When you say controlled, let's stop there. When you say controlled, please explain to me how they controlled for the confounding factors.
Well, it would depend on the study within the meta-analysis, but the LA veterans, for example, they looked at populations that were in a hospital, and they sent randomized half of them to one cafeteria.
How old were they on average?
I could look that up if you're interested, but middle age.
So not children, not babies, not infants, but people
who've been able. Can I finish answering your question? Because you said how long have they been in the study? So I just wanted to finish the thought there. Sure. They randomized half of them to one cafeteria, the other half to the other cafeteria. And what they did is they they actually created foods that where they took out the animal fats from foods and replaced it with polyunsaturated fats. And so they did this analysis where they looked at it was, I think, a 7 or 8 year trial. And that's like one of the randomized control trials that was in the Hooper meta-analysis. It was all others similar to that, where they had an intervention where they randomized people to a metabolic ward, and they ranged from like 3 to 8 years, depending on the study. They pooled that all together, and they did find that even in that short period of time, there was statistically significant lower risk of heart disease on the ones that had the saturated fat substituted out. So we can actually see the risk in interventions. It's obviously lower risk, because if we would have locked them in there for 30 years, the risk would have gone up significantly.
That's what we assume, but we don't know that because we've never done that. So say case in point, Michael, case in point, when people start a vegan diet, in the short term, they see really great results, right? And the same thing goes for the carnivore diet, right? People commonly say, sure, especially in related, okay, are we good?
Sorry, I was agreeing. Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, so people will say it's a demerit to the carnivore diet that all we have are short-term results, right? And so we'll have people who maybe within even a decade will try to give their testimony. It's anecdotal to be sure, but it's still testimony, right? And it's still things that can be traced and tracked back. It's still information that can be collected. It's still information that can be gathered, and we can get something. We can glean something from it. It's information, okay? If we cannot be sure about the long-term impact of a carnivore diet, and I'm in agreement with that, from taking the short-term results, and the same thing goes for the vegan diet, by the way, then in what universe am I supposed to take any short-term intervention and extrapolate that to the rest of the human being's life?
Well, because we do have long-term studies that look at diet trends, and we see that on average, people who eat more fiber, people who eat more plants have better health outcomes. That's why we take all of this research together. We're not just looking at one study here, one study there. We look at randomized control trials and then meta-analyses of those to see the intervention, the short-term outcome. Can we show that there's increased risk from decreased risk from when we remove saturated fat? We have Mendelian randomization, where we look at people who have genetically higher LDL levels, and risk goes way, way up for those people because they're living with that their entire life. I think we can agree when you eat red meat, your LDL goes up.
No.
And then we have.
I think you mentioned that. I think you mentioned that in your whatchamacallit, right? Whatever you sent before.
I certainly might have mentioned it because I think that's pretty unequivocally established. Do you disagree that LDL goes up with red meat consumption, saturated fat consumption?
So I understand that there could be a correlation, but I don't understand that it's definitive. That's the distinction that I want to make.
Sorry, you don't think there's that it's been established that when you eat more saturated fat,
a correlation has been established.
Okay. I mean, I haven't heard many people disagree with that. So that's
I don't actually disagree with it myself, but the science doesn't prove it. So even if I feel in my heart, no matter how much I feel in my heart, and no matter how much it seems like it's true, I cannot say that it's actually true.
All right. Well, let's look at that.
If you're going to show me another study, again, I just said it to your face that I in my heart think that it's the case.
Oh, okay.
I literally just said that.
Okay. Well, all right.
But if we're having a conversation and we're supposed to be scientific about it, we can't make definitive statements about things we don't know for sure. I was
trying to bring up a study and then you chewed me out for it. So
go ahead, just do whatever you want, Michael. Honestly.
Well, I'm sorry, Carson. I guess I can go to, hold on. So this is just the causal. So by the way, this is the causal chain here for how we know that red meat and saturated fat, they raise ApoB, which causes heart disease, which causes mortality. All of these things I establish here with papers that support those. So we're looking at, we wanted to know whether saturated fat raises ApoB. So we have Bergeron RCT is one of them. And then we have this Clark. So yeah, Clark meta-analysis is what I want to show you. So this is a meta-analysis of, I think, did I talk about this one already? It's 395 metabolic ward studies. So randomized controlled trials can show causation because they're testing a variable and isolating confounders. So this was a meta-analysis based on 395 of those. And they isocalorically replaced saturated fat with different fats. And yeah, I did show this one. So this is where we saw saturated fat increased LDL and polyunsaturated fat decreased LDL. So what would you say about that?
You use the term randomized controlled trial. And I think this is where we have some kind of disagreement about what that actually constitutes as. Okay. And so in your opinion, taking some people and having a short-term intervention when they're in a hospital somehow magically means that you've controlled for all factors. And that's not what that means. So it's either controlled or it's not. And if you say that an RCT can give us causality, okay, maybe that may be the case. But if we don't have a randomized control trial, like an actual legitimate randomized control, even if they say that it is, you can use common sense to say, well, was it actually controlled for? And if those people were free living individuals up until the point where they wound up in the hospital for who knows what, depending on whatever could have happened in their life leading up to that point, whether it be genetic, whether it be environmental, whether it be dietary, we don't know.
But that's the randomization. So have you looked at like the reason we can, so causality, we know this to a certain degree of confidence, right?
I disagree with that. I disagree with that wholeheartedly. We cannot prove causality. We cannot do that. We can show correlations.
We
can even show strong correlations, but we cannot prove that, yes, 100% this is this.
I thought you said you just agreed that you can.
I said that I personally, what does it matter that I personally agree if it's something that's not possible for us to do in science?
Okay, I just want to make sure we're talking about the same thing. So I thought you said just a minute ago that you did agree that randomized control trials can show causation.
I said if.
Did you not say that?
I said if.
For me?
I said if.
If they control properly?
If they are, yes, if they are properly conducted randomized control trials, then we can get some information that can bring us closer to closer to causality than anything that's weaker than that.
Okay, so let me just explain to you how this works in statistics. Is we look at the power of a study, which has to do with the number of people that were in the study, and we can say with a certain degree of confidence that the intervention caused the outcome, right? So we have a
certain degree of confidence, right?
Right.
So we feel relatively certain, right?
And usually they go to a 95% confidence level, which is sort of the standard in statistics. It's like the p equals 0.05. So an RCT can say with 95% confidence.
If it actually is one of those, though, right? Not if it's something that's not randomized, or not if it's something that's not properly randomized, not if it's not something that's properly controlled for.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. If the population wasn't like you couldn't extrapolate the results out to any population, it would have to do with the population that was sampled and all this.
Exactly.
But yeah, for sure.
So usually it has nothing to do with me. Usually it has absolutely nothing to do with people like me. Usually.
Well, I wouldn't say absolutely nothing. I mean,
because we're human.
Pardon me?
I was being facetious. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, like you are a human, I'm a human. And of course, people living in different areas, different genetics and everything, there's like infinite number of things different about all of us, but we can predict. So when they've done some of these analyses, I can pull it up if you want to see it, but when they predict were we talking about LDL or I can't remember what we were talking about, but like they predict the LDL based on what the intervention is going to be. And it's like dead on. And so when you can predict something like that, of course, like different individuals are going to respond differently. People might have certain food intolerances. People might respond better in certain ways. But at a population level, if we're talking about giving dietary advice on how we should eat, all else being equal, that's kind of what I'm basing my thing on. And then if you have an individual reason to act differently, like if you discover you have a food intolerance with beans or something, don't eat beans, eat something else. But
everybody has a food intolerance with beans because beans don't belong in the human body. Everybody's body responds in basically the exact same way. They get an allergic reaction in their digestive system, basically, that tells them that they're not supposed to be eating those things. And that's why we have to do ridiculous things like cook the ever-living crap out of them to make them even edible to begin with.
Well, I would agree you have to cook beans.
Absolutely.
Same as you have to cook chicken probably too, you would agree, right?
But not because there's something inherently wrong with the chicken. I mean, hello? The beans themselves are legitimately poisonous as they are.
Then why would we see that people who eat more beans live longer?
I cannot answer that question because the proper experiments that would need to be done for us to understand why that is haven't been done. All I can do is give you my opinion. And I don't think those people live as long as they could possibly, excuse me, I'm trying not to curse. I curse a lot just naturally, not.
I think that's fine. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's just simply because, you know, I don't think that those people are living as long as they could potentially live on account of eating crap like that. And so even if we show in the short term they have, you know, some kind of positive health markers, or they live longer than people who screw up more than they do, it still to me is not all that impressive in the grand scheme of things. And I think we could do better.
Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
So how did you come to that conclusion that there would be that eating, I would assume in place of beans, you would suggest eating red meat?
Obviously.
Right? Okay. So what would be your evidence for like the long-term consumption of red meat? Like what, or even not, if not evidence, like how did you come to
we established I don't have anything even remotely related to that right now.
Okay. Yes. But like, how did you come to the conclusion that eating red meat would have better long-term health outcomes than eating beans, for example?
One of the most compelling things for me is noticing that people who adopt the carnivore diet, first of all, that the carnivore diet is basically how we've been eating for most of our history as Homo sapiens, like as what we are today. And that tells me at least where to start in terms of what I should be putting in my body. And then I want to know, what the health outcomes could potentially be. When I see people eating an omnivorous diet, and this can go back to the beginning of the agricultural revolution, I see a decline in human health. That's all anybody with even a modicum of common sense would be able to see it. That when we're transitioning into what we have become today, the more meat we ate, the bigger and the stronger and the smarter we became. And then suddenly, after we decided that we wanted to include plants, all of a sudden we started to see reversals in things that we have been seeing grow. That to me is compelling enough. Then we take people who, these days in the modern times, you would think we have the best of everything available to us, especially considering medical technology and things like that. And yet we still can't keep each other alive eating plants for longer than 70 odd years in America, for example. And so when people eat an omnivorous diet, they get very sick. And then we try to cure their diseases. We treat their diseases with medication, and we may be able to, make them comfortable in the meantime, but they still will die from the complications of having an omnivorous diet. When we take these people and we put them on a vegan diet, they resolve their problems. When we take them and put them on a carnivore diet, they resolve their problems. And the main reason is because they're no longer competing. Their body is no longer having to try to deal with great deals of fat and carbohydrates together. So on the vegan side, you have the carbohydrates, and on the carnivore side, you have the fats. And one of these things is better at sustaining human life. One of these things is better at nourishing the human form than the other, because on one side, we have the two essential macronutrients, and on the other, we have garbage. Okay. And so the people who try, one more thing, the people who try the carnivore diet resolve the health problems that they have from basically every other diet that they tried that includes plants. And so that to me is compelling enough. And also, I have my own experience of resolving basically not everything, but almost every health problem that I had from when I was consuming plants, even heavily plant-based. I'm finished.
Okay. I wasn't writing things down as you went, but I'll try to respond to some of those, and maybe we can just
Sure.
take these one at a time. So, and sorry, just so I just want to write this down so I don't forget. But what was the thing you said just before the personal experience one?
It was likely that
Oh, omnivores
Okay.
are yeah, I remember. It was, you were saying that carbohydrates and like whether it's vegan or carnivore, they both improve off of kind of the standard diet.
yeah, in the
right?
short term, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
and not just standard, but like even heavily plant-based, because I was heavily plant-based. I wasn't standard American when at the
Sure.
point when I transitioned. Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay, so let's just talk ancestral diet first. So,
Sure.
I would I would agree with you to some extent on this. Do you think that our ancestors were at significant risk of starvation?
They were at significant risk of a little bit of everything.
Totally. So,
What kind of question is that?
well, I'm just it's establishing common ground. So,
Sure.
would you? So remember when I showed that pyramid? It's like the energy balance thing. Like
Yeah.
any calorie is good when you're starving, right? Would you agree with that?
Yeah. Yeah,
So
I
even
agree with that.
yeah. So like if there was like a hypothetical ancestral population that that had like a bunch of blueberries or beans or whatever you think is like bad for us today, they would probably do better than
They would have
the
died.
colony.
What would they have had? They would have had blueberry. Can you please explain to me what they would have had? Blueberries
Just
and what?
any plant, like whatever plant. It's I'm just saying like
They would have
the
died off.
availability of. Pardon me.
They would have died off if all they had were plants. What kind of hypothetical are you posing?
Well, I'm saying that any calories is better than scarcity of calories, and so if
Sure.
if you have so that's what I would say is the reason that people quote unquote thrived ancestrally on whether it was carnivore or like high percentage of calories as meat. It's like they didn't need to worry about chronic diseases killing them at 80 or 70, and they were dead long before that, right? So evolutionary speaking, when we're looking at like what food is good, we're looking at foods that make it most likely that we're going to pass on our genes successfully, correct?
Sure.
Okay. So the evolutionary diet that we adapted to like has nothing to say about what's going to kill us at 70 or 80, right?
Please continue.
Okay. Well, that's just my point. Is like you can't look at ancestrally and say like we ate this certain way, we are adapted to eat this certain way, therefore it's good for us now in terms of long-term
Was
health.
that the only?
I'm saying we had a scarcity of just almost we had a scarcity of calories back then. So any calorie we ate is good, and then evolutionarily speaking, there was no advantage or there's no advantage to eating a certain way that predicts what long-term health risks are going to be. Go ahead.
Okay, so is your point that even if we got all the benefits that we got from eating meat, that it still could have killed us in the end younger than we could potentially have lived?
Totally, absolutely.
And so understanding that humans cannot survive on a plant-based diet, or I should say a vegan diet especially, without supplementation, understanding that people who, such as myself, were heavily plant-based and were suffering with problems that would have made it very difficult for us. I mean, considering the history of my family, maybe I could make it 60, 70 years. That's not impressive either.
Where are you getting the 60, 70 year thing? I'm not quite following that.
Because I'm basing it off of not only my family history of what ages the people in my family have died because they eat garbage, but then also what the average is for people in America right now, which I think is less than 75, right?
Right,
And
but
I'm
like the average
American,
American isn't eating the way that I'm advocating that we eat, right?
And I mean, that's why I changed my eating habits, right?
Yeah.
But if I
Yeah, but, I
hadn't,
mean, you
right,
can change
if
from
I
the
had
standard.
continued to eat like crap, then that would be what my expectation is, a reasonable expectation.
On average, yeah, I would agree. But like, nobody's saying you should eat like hyper processed or
I'm not
ultra
talking about
processed.
because I said before that that wasn't what my diet was like, but my health was still failing. I said that I was heavily plant-based. When I say heavily plant-based, I don't mean I was eating Oreos. I
Well, you
mean, it
compare
was like a
yourself
whole
to
food
the
plant-based kind of
average
thing.
American in terms of the expected health range. So I would assume you meant you'd be eating the same way as them. So how
Because
were you?
I do not think that, considering all of the information put together, I could have, considering how my health was failing, why would I put myself at longer than that?
Yeah. So, and this actually, so this brings us to maybe the second point. It's a good transition into like, why do you think it is that when, and I would say this is true of like a lot of diets, but carnivore and vegan, when people first go onto it, they see improvements in how they feel and certain health outcomes and
I
certain
said it
markers.
before. Why?
Yeah. Oh, what do you think?
Now I want to know what you think because I already said it.
Oh, okay. Well, what I think is that they are elimination diets, and
Yep.
it's yeah. So you agree? So it's usually there's like some food intolerance or something that you're likely experiencing, and then when you do an extreme elimination diet, carnivore and vegan are two really good examples of this. You're eliminating a lot of foods, and if one of those foods is the food that was giving you problems, you've got that out of your diet.
It's not just simply that either. It's also the fact that you're no longer forcing your body to have to deal with this constant influx of two types of energy that it can't properly deal with at the same time.
Okay, so that's another good one. So I would agree with you, by the way. If I had to choose between a high fat and a very low fat diet, I would choose a high fat diet, but it would be plant fats. So, but I don't know. Right? Like I showed the evidence.
Right.
I showed the evidence
you showed some information on the screen. I seen it. I saw it. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, I showed the intervention where they replaced complex carbs with various fat sources.
And then the short-term intervention that was on the people who were already sick. Yeah.
Okay. The point being, we saw markedly improved health markers for the ones that were plant fats were substituted for complex carbs, and markedly worse where saturated fat, meat fats were substituted for complex carbs. But why would you think that we have to eat only high fat or low fat diets? Why can't we have a middle diet where we have carbs and fats? Like, what's wrong with that?
First of all, carbs are non-essential in the human diet, and people should avoid them as much as possible because they're poison. When I say first of all, that's basically it in a nutshell.
How do you come to the conclusion that carbs are poison?
Because basically every single time you put them in your body, they damage you in some way, shape, or form.
How did you come to that conclusion?
Because it's the case, it's the truth. Basically, you eat even when it comes to something as basic as blood sugar regulation and the fact that we have our insulin, such a high insulin response. And this is something that if it continues over time can lead to conditions such as diabetes. For example, the fact that carbohydrates are basically sugar, and it almost doesn't matter what kind of carbohydrate you consume. It is going to break down to the same thing in the body, something that the body does not know how to properly handle. The blood can only hold 4 grams of carbohydrates or glucose. I get perhaps my terminology is getting a little mixed up. It can only hold that much at any given time. And so the idea that, well, why can't we have a moderate carbohydrate? Your body can't handle that many carbohydrates at one time. Basically, what it's going to do after a while is store it as fat, because fat is essential, and it recognizes it's starving and it's thinking, this human, every time it eats, it doesn't actually give me real nutrition. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this crap that I don't know what else to do with, and I'm going to turn it into fat, so that when they eventually run out of that, because usually in the past, maybe it might have been fruit and seasonal, and then we just would have been screwed if we didn't have any fat on us after that, right? So that's what it decides to do with the carbohydrates. It doesn't store it as carbs. It doesn't store it as glucose. It produces, your body, when you feed it fat and protein, produces only as much glucose as it needs at any given time. It runs off of ketones primarily, and it runs very well that way. And you are not likely to run into health issues such as diabetes, improper, people say insulin resistance, whatever term you want to use for it, without the influence of carbohydrates. And so I'm trying to figure out why we're trying so hard to include something that's not essential in the diet that, basically is I don't know what else to say, Michael. It's a poison.
Well, I don't think you provided any evidence that it's a poison. You pointed to some mechanisms that I don't think are borne out in any evidence. And what I care about
The
is
idea is that we have a correlation, we don't have causation, sure. But the same thing goes for any information that you could provide.
what correlation even? What correlation did you point to? You just pointed to mechanisms.
Okay, Michael, I want you to just bear with me for a second. What I was saying was that when people basically, it's a virtual impossibility for a person to have problems with insulin regulation unless they're consuming carbohydrates. Is that a controversial statement for you?
I don't think so. But
okay, so
but
then
can I say why that doesn't matter?
Okay, go ahead. Oh, no.
Yeah,
What I would prefer to hear is what part of what I just said was something that you thought wasn't just a fact of life.
Well, carbs are poison is one. Like, I don't think that's a fact. Just because
okay, fine. Let's say that it's not, Michael. Let's say that it's not a. Okay, no, we can quickly squash this. Let's say that it's not a fact. Let's say that it's my opinion. Fine.
Okay, sure. That's fine. I'm always going to ask, like,
they're poisonous though.
How did you come to that?
And everybody who's listening to this right now, anybody who could be seeing this, the reason why you are as sick as you are likely is because you keep eating carbohydrates. And if you were to stop eating carbohydrates and you were to eat appropriate amounts of fat and protein for your body type, for your age, whatever it is, you will see your health improve in ways you cannot imagine. I mean, not even just physical health, but mental health. And no, I don't have a mechanism to point to, Michael. I don't have anything like that.
I don't care about if you have a mechanism to point to. I'd prefer if you pointed to outcomes that were borne out in the evidence of what's this?
This is enough for me.
Okay. Do you think that's it? I mean, people, okay.
That's why I told them to try it. I didn't say it was going to 100% work for them.
Yeah, but you can point to any diet and say, try it and see if it works for you. Like have you heard of a frugivore
yes, you're
diet?
Absolutely right, Jackie? Michael. You're absolutely right. And when people try a vegan diet, because people tell them that it's so good and it's so great for them and plant-based everything is great, and then their health starts to fail, that's the best proof that that diet is not actually going to work for them. And when you see that there are millions and millions and millions of people with the same outcome, you don't need to wait around for somebody in a research lab in a lab coat to tell you what the reasonable expectation of your result is going to be.
Do you think that there's a risk that you could try a certain diet and feel better, and then that diet could cause some severe long-term problems for you that you wouldn't be able to notice in the first,
obviously, a little bit of anything is possible, Michael.
Okay. Do you think that might be a risk of your diet?
Duh.
Okay.
I literally just said that.
Is that concerning for you at all?
No, it's not, Michael.
Why not?
Likely for the same reason that even though whatever it is that you're doing for yourself right now, you cannot possibly know what the outcome is going to be for you, but you still choose to do it because you were convinced by some other information, right?
Well, here's the difference. The other information that I was convinced by is a very
not real life outcomes.
Causal chain.
It's not real life outcomes.
It is real life outcomes.
And it's correlative and it's not causative.
Real lifetime long follow-up studies on people.
You can say it's causative all you want to, Michael, but it's correlative. From now until the end of time, it will be correlative.
Based on randomized controlled trials. That's not correlation.
They're not properly randomized and they are not properly controlled.
How do you know that? Go ahead and point to.
It is impossible.
What do you mean it's impossible?
Well, let's work through this together. In order for us to know what exactly is the cause for any particular outcome when anybody undertakes any given diet, what would need to be done for us to be able to make a definitive statement about that?
It's a simple question with a complex answer. Because
very complex, yes.
Yeah. And so I would go back to the European Atherosclerosis Consensus Panel statement and the 7 or whatever it was conditions that they listed for causality and how they came to that conclusion. But it's based on.
They can say that it's causality without actually proving causality. Is that what you're telling me right now? And that's compelling to you? You
Well-
can't, and you can employ even a little bit of common sense to look at it and be like, well, wait a minute, even if they, understanding what it would take for us to actually achieve causality, they're falling short of that, but I'm just going to take their word for it because of credentials or something.
No, I take their word for it, quote unquote, because I understand. I'm just gonna go to it here. I don't know if you can pull
Sure.
it up on screen, Carson. But so I'm sorry if this is small. I can pull up the actual study if it's easier to read. But their criteria are this, and it's so 8 different criteria, and it's basically so LDL and other so LDL and other lipoprotein B, so ApoB containing lipoproteins, are directly implicated in the initiation and progression of heart disease. Experimentally induced elevations of plasma LDL and other ApoB containing lipoproteins lead to atherosclerosis in all mammalian species studied. So plausibility, they have strength. LDL has led to markedly higher lifelong elevations, led to markedly higher lifetime risk. They have specificity. It's like when we control out other variables. They have consistency. We see this in across, like with a very homogeneous, high homogeneity in studies, where we see this across the board. We see the temporal factor, where the dropping of LDL always precedes LDL. So like we can go through this, but like it's not just them claiming it. They have defined their criteria for causality.
And I'm sure they're doing their very best, Michael, but that none of what you're saying right now is anything remotely related to what we would need to do in order to be able to say it definitively.
Well,
I'm sure they're trying their very best, and I'm sure that is
fallibilism is a consensus position.
That we have these limitations, but it is what it is.
Of course, like, and like gravity could be wrong, right? Like we could question anything, but the point is,
but
like,
gravity is one of the most easiest, and this is anecdotal. It's anecdotal. It's just me demonstrating that. Go ahead, Carson.
Sorry, can I hop in and ask you each a question?
Sure.
Okay, we have about 8 minutes left, and I think this is the most important question to ask in any situation like this. So I'll start with Michael, but I'm going to ask Jackie the exact same question, and then hopefully we'll have a couple minutes to talk after that. Michael, what is the most minimal amount of studies of sorts that would convince you that the carnivore diet is as equal to what you think the best diet is currently or better? And you can use unrealistic ideas like taking people as babies and keeping them in rooms for however long. It can be generational. It can be like an amount of years that you couldn't live for. What would have had to happen to convince you of this? The most minimal thing to happen.
Yeah. Well, okay. So with plant-based diets and everything I see that more red meat is bad, more plants is good. People that eat plants live longer. So I would need to see something that goes against that. Like, for example, if we studied carnivores and like the risk curve went from more meat, and then all meat, it suddenly dropped off. If we saw that over long, like a certain number of long-term studies, that would be interesting. If we saw some randomized control trials where we took 2 groups, this would never be ethical because of how strong the evidence is against where we introduce meat. It wouldn't take a lot, to be honest, because there's no evidence on it. Like the same as like the lollipop diet. It's like there's no evidence on it, but if I saw some, I'd be convinced pretty easily.
Okay, and Jackie, same for you. What would it take to be convinced that some form of a whole food vegan diet is as likely to be as healthy as the diet you think is best now, or healthier?
Literally, any generation of humans would have been able to survive purely vegan and continue to produce offspring.
Okay, and now you guys can just discuss what each other's answers were.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of having no proof of something, I mean, I don't even know if you recognize that you're basically talking about your own diet when you say that. The same way that you say, oh, okay, you mentioned before about basically extrapolating, right? And so I want to know why you think the extrapolation works on your side, but it doesn't work on our side.
Yeah, great question. I think it works on my side because if we look at like the trends and what direction they point in, all of the trends point to the more fiber, the more plants you eat, the better the outcomes. And then on your side, the more meat, the more saturated fat you eat, the worse the outcomes. So if
so it doesn't matter to you at all. So
let me finish this real quick.
Go ahead. Yeah,
So-
sorry to interrupt.
So
Go ahead.
continue those lines and extrapolate. Mine just follows the line. Yours requires the line to drop off all of a sudden at like 100% meat.
So I think one of the difficulties that we have is I'm always constantly talking about a vegan diet, and you're talking about something that's not a vegan diet. As far as I'm concerned, as soon as when you try to extrapolate, less meat is better, less meat must be better, no meat must be the absolute best, people's health starts to tank. It just completely freaking tanks.
Whose health? What are you talking about?
Vegans is what I'm talking about. And that's why so
What's
many
the
people
evidence
drop
of that?
out. What's the evidence that people are not able to sustain their vegan diet?
Yeah.
Are we sure? I didn't know it was questioned.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, you can find anecdotes of everyone struggling on every diet. But I mean, what's the evidence that vegans have a higher risk of struggling on their diet than any other diet?
I didn't say anything about risk. I said legitimately, when they're on the diet, they struggle and they quit the diet on account of health.
Yes, that's what I'm asking. Is like, what's your evidence that more of them struggle than any other that people on any other diet struggle?
I'm pretty sure some data collection was done, and it was something like upwards of more than 80% of people who try a vegan diet will stop a vegan diet. Of course, there are different reasons why they stop.
Talking about the Fuanalytics study?
I don't think it's I think that's what a lot of people quote or will cite. That particular study says some information about like different reasons why people quit. But if you actually look at the information, if you actually try to get to the bottom of why people quit the vegan diet, and you find that they do it because of health failure.
Yeah, so that was based on this Fuanalytics thing. I see this, that 84% of vegans quit. And how that was determined is they asked the question, did you ever eat meat? And if they said yes, then they asked, have you ever eaten a vegetarian or vegan diet? And then they subgrouped by vegan and vegetarian. If they said, no, I've never eaten meat, then they subgrouped that to vegan, vegetarian. And so they ended up with 167 current vegetarians, 1,037 past vegetarians. So that's 16%. And that's how they got the 84, is they just asked people, have you ever eaten it? And are you eating it now? That's where this 84% thing came from, was just those two questions. And when they subgrouped it down by vegans and they looked at long-term vegans, what is it? So 34% of the vegetarians who quit did so in the first 3 months, and over 50% in the first year. But and then so if we look at like the Epic Oxford study, for example, almost 3/4 of self-identified vegans at baseline also identified as vegan 20 years after follow-up, and that's a sample size of like 65,000 people. So like,
and can I just ask you a question? When they determine if these people are vegan, how do they actually determine if they're vegan?
Survey. Well, the Epic Oxford was based on survey questions. So like, how did you answer the survey now? How did you answer the survey 20 years from now? And you answered the same way, kind of thing. So
go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I was just gonna come back to like, so I know that paper is like is very commonly like misquoted like the 84% thing floats around and everything, but like other than that,
the more compelling thing against it would be the fact that the reasons why they listed were so varied. But what I care about more is the actual legit outcomes for people. And so you mentioned before that I think you were trying to discount anecdotes as though they don't matter. But when it comes to the vegan diet, that's basically all we can rely on. The same thing goes for the carnivore diet, because neither of them have been tested enough for us to be able to be sure. So if the 84% is not reliable because the sample size is too small, we can't even be sure.
Sample size wasn't the problem there. Just to
there's a multitude of problems with it, because I will say, even for myself, that the reasons that they gave were kind of all over the place. They were giving different reasons for why their outcomes were what they were. Do you disagree with that? You look like you don't agree with me.
Well, sorry, I was just waiting for you to finish. I didn't quite understand the point. Like people.
No, I'm just saying that there's more than one reason why that information may not be reliable. But
okay,
from what I'm just using it as information, the same as I do if you present something, if you present a study or whatever, I recognize the flaws in those, but I still acknowledge that it can be information that's useful in a different way.
Okay. I know we're like about at our time. Is there anything else, Carson, you wanted to go through or shift to before we sign off? And Jackie, I'm not sure if you have a hard stop.
No, I have a handful of ideas, but I do think that we should respect Jackie's time. So yeah.
I just want to double check if there are any questions. Carson.
There were. Let me glance real quick.
We can at least do that if there are any. It's just, the whole thing is that, as far as I'm concerned, every little bit of information that we get, no matter how flawed it is data or information that we can use. And not any one of those things is the definitive thing. But when we put it all together, like if we're trying to build a case for something, when we put it all together, the same as you do, I do the same thing on the other side. It's just that it's much more compelling for me, the real life outcomes.
You keep saying real life outcomes, but like, how would you like? The way I think about real life outcomes is like studies, because they're looking at populations who followed a diet, populations who ate a certain way, interventions
but as
where
you mentioned,
people were fed certain ways versus other ways versus control. So are you talking, when you say outcomes, are you talking just like personal anecdotes? Is that the only thing?
That's what it usually boils down to.
But like, how could, like, there's personal anecdotes, like, of carnivores doing poorly, of carnivores doing well. There's personal anecdotes.
Exactly. And I take all of them seriously, and I take all of them and put them all together. The same thing goes with the vegans.
But how could you possibly come to any conclusion from those? Because they're just all over the place.
I mean, my whole message this whole time has been that everything is, not proven. That none of the things that we're talking about tonight are actually proven. That's my point of view. So you asking me that question is just kind of strange, because that's been my position this entire time. We cannot be sure.
I didn't say prove. You said I'm asking about your opinion. You said you look at anecdotes and formulate your opinion. So why, like, it just seems just a completely wild way.
And also, you're making it seem like that's the only thing that I do, when I already mentioned before that I'm taking all the information all together.
What other information?
The same type of information that you provided before. I don't take that information. I don't treat that information as though it doesn't exist.
All right. And so when you look at the type of information that I was providing, is there anything, like, would you agree that leans pretty heavily towards a plant-based or mostly plant-based diet being best or better, at least, than a mostly meat-based diet?
No.
Why not?
Because it's a place to start, and then from there I look at what actually happens when people
But sorry. So the second step aside, because you said you look at the type of information that I was presenting, and probably
So foundationally speaking, I fell for that. And that's why I ate the way that I was eating before, and that's why my health was as bad as it was.
I'm asking about your opinion now. So you said you look at that type of information, right? I'm understanding right, to formulate your opinion today?
I'm saying I have considered this, because none of the information that you showed is all that new, right? So
there's studies from 2024, 2023, but yeah, I mean, it's pretty consistent over time. Yeah, I would agree. Some of it.
Yeah, I agree that it's very consistent over time. I agree with that.
Okay.
And so I don't unless you show me something that's novel, unless you show me something that's new, unless you show me something, that has more veracity.
Oh, sorry. We can go to that, Carson. I don't feel like I don't quite understand your answer to the question. So
sure.
you said you're basing your opinion, like I'm interested in your opinion today, not like what you fell for in the past or whatever, but you have a certain opinion about like the best diet to eat. And you said part of how you come to that opinion is by looking at the type of evidence I was providing. Right. And then there's other stuff as well. I want to talk about the other stuff in a second, but for just the other, like the scientific evidence stuff, would you agree that most of the scientific evidence stuff points towards like carnivore bad, plant-based or mostly plant-based good?
Based on the information alone, if I wasn't looking at anything else, I would have almost no choice but to say, that if the information shows what it's showing, then at least in whatever context the information is relevant in, that would be the case.
Okay, so you agree that like most of the papers point to sort of agree with what I'm saying.
There's a correlation. If I can take a look at the information a little closer to make sure that the information gathering was done correctly, to make sure to actually ask the questions of what is considered red meat, to actually ask the questions of, you really have to look at the studies very carefully to see if you can take them seriously at all. And so on face value, if you just take a look at the abstract or just take a look at the conclusion, it would feel very strongly in the side of, it's better for humans to have a plant-based diet, but that's not all I look at. I just want to make that clear.
Okay, yeah. But like that line of evidence, you think it goes more in favor of what I'm saying, and then there's other stuff.
If you don't actually critically analyze it, then yeah.
No, not. I'm saying if you do critically analyze to your heart's. Okay.
No, the more you analyze it, the more you realize that it doesn't have anywhere near as much veracity as you would hope that it does. But if you just take a very cursory look at it, if you just take a look at the abstract, if you just take a look at the conclusion, and if you don't actually consider what.
Opinion.
Go ahead.
I'm talking about your opinion, not like, because you said that you've looked at some of the evidence, and the scientific evidence. How has the scientific evidence impacted your opinion? Has it made it have you read the scientific evidence and thought meat is better or plants are better based on the scientific evidence alone?
There's a lot of contradictory evidence that's out there, so it's difficult for me to make an opinion based on any of the information that I may be privy to. I remain agnostic, is what I do.
So the balance of scientific evidence you're right down the middle. It hasn't shifted. You're not leaning one way or the other.
I'm waiting for some evidence, and when I get the evidence, then I can feel that I can feel comfortable and confident, saying, okay, this side seems a little bit stronger, or the other side seems a little bit stronger. But until I start to see that type of evidence, I have no option but to remain agnostic.
Okay, so all of the randomized control trials,
they're not randomized, they're not controlled.
They are randomized, they are controlled.
They are not. They are absolutely not.
Okay, well, I mean, I would be curious to hear what your problem is with like Hooper 2020, for example, or the Clark meta-analysis that I showed.
I think we have legitimately already been over this.
I don't remember you pointing out any problem with them.
When we were talking about what would constitute proper control.
Okay, and I gave you the example of the LA veterans RCT where
the people who are already and what were their average age? You said they were in their middle age.
Middle age, yeah.
Yeah, and that it's almost like it doesn't even it's inconsequential to you. Like it doesn't matter, and it's like I don't know how to get you to understand that taking people who were free living human beings for at least 3.5 decades, and then after they're already, what were you saying? They're already admitted to some kind of institution.
They're in a hospital for whatever.
If for whatever, it doesn't matter. We're not going to really worry about what it is. And this kind of nonchalant attitude.
They were randomized. That's the point. Is like they were randomized into one of two different groups. We saw a statistically significant decrease in risk for the ones who got the plant fats.
My understanding of what it means to be randomized is a bit broader than that. And in any case, the more important step would be whether or not it's properly controlled. You mentioned that they took some steps. They tried to control who was given what kind of food to eat. But we also have to think about the time frame as well.
Yeah, 6 to 8 years.
And let's say that for this particular study, let's say that my understanding of what it means for something to be properly randomized actually does match in this case. We're talking about one study among how many?
If we're talking about the Hooper
that are
meta-analysis,
properly randomized or not properly randomized is what we're comparing it to.
yeah, I can look at, if my brain serves right, there's like between 15 and 20 in total RCTs that they looked at, and they subgrouped them out by like
You
how
keep saying RCTs, and even if I were to grant you the randomized part, the control part, absolutely not.
well, control just means that it's a controlled intervention. They have a control group and they have an intervention group, and they give the treatment to the intervention, not to the control.
My understanding of control is that you need to make sure that there are no confounding factors. That's what my understanding of control is.
Yeah, so that would be true in like a prospective cohort study. If you were looking at a population and trying to say like, did meat eaters generally do better or generally do worse? And so we take all the meat eaters and look at their health outcomes, and all the others, the non-meat eaters, and look at their health outcomes or whatever. And then what we would do is we'd look at like, what are the other lifestyle factors that those groups have? So like maybe meat eaters have
and this becomes irrelevant in a randomized control trial. Why?
It's not. I'm just saying when you said control and you're talking about confounding factors, you're talking about prospective cohort studies. That's confounding factors.
I think I'm ready to move on, Carson.
Okay.
Oh, you want me to just you want to just answer the question as it is on screen?
You're muted, Carson.
Oh, he really is. I didn't even know this.
Sorry about that. There were a few other questions, but most of them were just about why you don't accept certain studies. So we can ignore most of those. Let's go ahead.
It isn't that I don't necessarily accept them. I understand that they're there. They're information. They can come in handy, but they go on the shelf, remains to be seen until I see some real evidence.
Yeah.
It's very simple.
And I totally respect that. Let's go ahead and answer this question, and then we'll let you get going because of it being very late where you're at.
Thank you. Okay, so of course, there are many things. We're genetically similar to basically every creature in some way, to some extent on the planet, because we're all evolved from the same thing. So it wouldn't matter how biologically or genetically similar we are if at the end of the day, we have completely different digestive systems right now. And so we have evolved even after branching off from whichever simian probably we want to say, because I'm not an evolutionary scientist or anything like that. So my terminology is going to be completely all messed up. But the idea is, from wherever we branched off, the changes that have happened since then are significant enough. We are not capable of digesting foods the same way that they do. I think our closest relative, whatever word you want to use, they have to eat upward for most of the day. More than half of their day basically is spent just consuming fibrous foods so they can break it down. And also the way that they try to get nutrition is very different. Just look it up from how we would get our nutrition. Our digestive systems, the way that we chew our food, the way that we swallow our food, are the acid balance in our stomach, and all of these kinds of things are so different from them, no matter how similar we are genetically or biologically. I don't know what this question is trying to ask. Like, is this person assuming that we would be frugivores? Because that is just absolutely ridiculous.
I think the question might be assuming, and I haven't looked into this myself, but that if you look at groups of animals, the ones that are closer to each other have closer diets to each other. But if that weren't the case, then that would lean more towards what you're saying. And I don't think that it necessarily
we do have vastly different diets. And so I would argue any person that thinks that we should be eating the same way that any of our ape cousins or whatever, where we are apes, but you know what I mean? Like, if they think that that's possible, then they can just try it for themselves. They can just try it and see how it works out for them. We are not equipped to do anything even remotely related to what they do. And they're not equipped to do what we do. And that is just, I don't know. I'm trying very hard, but I don't know how to take this person seriously.
No, that's fine.
I don't know what they're getting. I don't understand what they're.
Yeah, I think it would be interesting to look into various different animals, like to see if, like, the majority of birds some are very different from each other, if the majority of them eat a very similar diet. And then if you take all animals, like ruminant animals are closer to each other than they are to other animals. And so seeing like how similar their diets, I think it's interesting. It doesn't tell us anything for sure. Michael, do you have any comments on this question or her response to this question?
Not really. I'm probably more in Jackie's camp than this person's camp, honestly, with respect to this question. But I know there's, I've looked into some of the evidence on what ancestrally our diets are. I don't believe we were mostly frugivores ancestrally. I also think there's pretty good evidence that we did eat carbs ancestrally, but like I haven't looked. I'm not super knowledgeable in it, so I would just.
From what I understand, more specifically than carbs, it's like we ate like fibrous things, like tubers or something like that, but they didn't really give us much of anything. I'm not even sure. I mean, based on what I heard, I'm not even sure why people were eating them. Maybe they just tasted good or something. It just seems to be so. It just seemed like something that people did, or whatever the iteration that people did just because they could. The way that I've heard it described.
People are trying to stay alive, so they eat what they can find, whether that's hunting meat or like foraging for whatever.
Yeah, maybe they thought it had some kind of benefit. I don't know, but it just sounds real strange.
I don't think that like we can look at that and make conclusions based on what's good for us today. I keep seeing people talk about like.
I do think so, and it's just simply because of how our bodies have. How can I even put this? I think that there are some very clear signs how the body is supposed to function. And that when we eat what some people refer to as a species appropriate diet, we find a lot of the modern issues that people are suffering from just are alleviated. And I don't think that there is such a thing as a perfect diet in the way that then it would alleviate every single problem for every single human, that it wouldn't cause any problems. I think that's ridiculous because we're evolving and the world is always trying to kill us. So I don't think that there is a perfect diet that will never harm people. But I just want to say, basically, I disagree with that. I think that there's a lot that we can learn from there. And then also with the modern day, the evidence of how poorly we've done on plants and the evidence of how much better we can do on meat.
What evidence?
Our history. How can I even put this? Not only is it our history, and we can take information from other fields such as anthropology and paleoanthropology, and we can understand more about our physiology. We can understand more about our biology and how we absorb nutrients and things like that, what's more bioavailable, things like that, and what types of foods tend to cause problems such as inflammation and things like that in the body. Again, there's a wealth of scientific evidence. It isn't as though I think that every single one of these things can tell us anything definitively. But when I say that I take everything all together and I build a picture of what seems like it would be the best diet, this is the type of thing that I'm talking about.
Yeah. So you talked about several things that are researched in science. I would love to talk about any one of those individually. I know we're kind of past our time, but like those are the kinds of things that I think are interesting to talk about. Like anecdotes, I don't really care.
Anecdotes don't mean anything because I don't know why, because we have no information about the veracity of the vegan diet at all without anecdotes. But we can just discount them however we want.
Anecdotes because they're not controlled, and it's like you have no way of.
Now you care about control. Now you care about
always care about control. Why did you think I never didn't care about control? Because
of how nonchalantly you were acting when I was explaining before about how the experiments, or no, not experiments, because they don't do any experiments. Whatever the poor research gathering that was done that they didn't properly control, and you were just like, well, yeah, I mean, they were just middle aged. Well, yeah, I mean, it seemed to be randomized. In my understanding, it wasn't properly randomized.
I don't understand. Like, do you think control means you have to have people from all ages?
That's part of it. That's just one very small part of it.
No, not in an RCT. You don't.
You would need to be able to test it, especially because we're testing for heart health outcomes. That would be the reason why. And so some of these things, such as heart disease, you said that some signs may develop, the idea of, okay, could this person possibly be at risk? Maybe we can see that early on, but nobody's developing heart disease that young, right? These things, it takes decades for that to come into play. And so, yes, we would need to control as much as humanly possible, which is not very much at all, whatever is going on in this person's life, so that we would know definitively what is actually affecting that outcome for that type of human being. And then we would have to do it for different types of human beings, because we need to make sure that it's applicable to everybody and not just the people who are genetically similar to the people that were tested. Little things like that. Like all of these things matter.
They do matter. I agree. And that's like, oh man, I don't even know where to start. Like we've kind of been through some of this on the RCT. It's like the randomization is the control, but yes, obviously it's just a population of people. And so how do you know if that extrapolates out to people outside of that population? I think generally speaking, you'd be looking for a reason to think it does, unless otherwise proven. So unless you have a good reason to think that you would be different from those people.
I have every reason to think that I would be different from those people, even just based on my genetics, even just that one basic thing. What works for Michael from whatever his genetics are, for whatever is going on with his family, is what's going to be applicable to Michael very specifically. And if it coincides with what was going on with Jackie, it's like, imagine it's a Venn diagram. Whatever's in the middle is freaking coincidence as far as I'm concerned.
Well, we are very genetically similar, you and I, and it's likely...
we're very genetically similar to the simians, the frugivores, whatever the person was trying to say before too.
A lot more you and I would assume, than them, right? A lot more.
But even that still makes a difference.
We're genetically similar to mice, but mice data generally doesn't bear out in humans also, right? Like we're talking...
and some health outcomes for some people with very specific circumstances don't work out for the same types of for people because of something about them that makes them a little different.
Sure, but when we look at...
that's why it matters, and that's why if they're going to do this test, if they test it on 70,000 Japanese old men, what does that have to do with me?
That wasn't 70,000 Japanese old men.
I'm just using it for an example.
Yeah, and that's why I showed some U.S. cohorts and people in third world.
But even still, Michael, even when you say that, it's like, Michael, like, you're Canadian, but still North American, right? And I just want you to imagine where did people who are modern day Canadians come from, and where do people who are modern day Americans come from? Like, I'm American, but the caveat to that is the African part. So even something like that is what I'm trying to get at.
Okay. Do you think that
it almost means
people of
nothing
African American descent aren't included in U.S. populations? Like, do you think that they would have different health outcomes?
I think that it is possible that there could be a difference and that it can make a significant difference, but we don't know because we can't do the proper experiments to be able to make that answer definitive. And so that's why you take the information with a grain of salt, you put it on a shelf that says it remains to be seen, and you wait for more information until you can paint a better picture.
And then go down the path about that, because like a lot of these studies, like the Women's Health Initiative, the Nurses Health Professionals Follow-up Study, the Health Professionals Follow-up Study, and the Nurses Health Study, all of these looked at populations, right? Like we're talking about millions of people, and they subgroup them by race. And so we can look at, I haven't looked at that, but we can look at that if you want. If I looked at that and pulled some information on African American descent specific people, and do you think that if I looked at that and provided that to you, and they had better health outcomes from consuming more plants, worse health outcomes from consuming more meat, would that be convincing for you?
It would be information that I could use potentially.
Well, you don't use it. We've been through this, and you said that with all of the evidence that I provide, you said I don't lean. I
don't consider it. I don't necessarily consider it like evidence the way that you think that it's evidence. It's information to me. So it matters. It means something, but you haven't demonstrated it. You haven't proven anything. You've just showed that in whatever the situation was, that those people, whoever collected that information, put some research together, but they didn't do it in an appropriate way to be able to prove causation. And in any case,
sorry, I just had a couple questions that I wanted to ask each of you to kind of clarify
sure, after
things.
Your questions, Carlson, we'll finish up.
Okay. So my question for Jackie would be, your current diet, is any of it based on taking in the information that Michael's referring to? Is it using any information from RCT studies, or would you say that almost all of it is based on other findings and other anecdotal stories?
Basically, it's not just nutrition science that I focus on. I take the big picture. So any information that we get from the various sciences that are available to us can help me paint the picture of what I think is the best diet for a human to undertake. Now, in the beginning, I believed and trusted the information a lot more strongly than I should have. And I moved towards a heavily plant-based diet, assuming I would get those same outcomes, assuming that everything would be hunky-dory. But things went horribly wrong, and I was very curious as to why that would be. And so I decided to be my own N1 and just test, possibly, if I try a meat-based diet, I'm thinking I'm going to get heart disease. I'm thinking I'm going to make all of my digestive issues much worse. I'm thinking it's going to be a complete disaster, but it wasn't. And so I noticed that when people do, and I want this to just be understood, that I believe there is a strong scientific basis for why it does work as well as it does. It hasn't been strongly tested, so I can't put forth any the legitimate evidence that says yes, and definitively here it is. That doesn't make any sense, right? But we can just take the amalgamation of the information that from what we understand about our history, from what we understand about what we've eaten, from what we understand about the different ways that these different foods affect us in our body, and then we can also take a look at the real life outcomes of people. It's everything all together.
Gotcha.
And
Okay.
that's how I get to where I get.
Okay. And then really quick before Michael's last question, and then we'll be done. I just want to point out, as far as the race and sex element of it, it is pretty fascinating. I don't have all the numbers, but I remember looking at different races when it comes to getting diabetes, and the risk of getting diabetes starts around a BMI of 25 for Asians, but it's around 30 for Caucasians. And so it is fascinating, and I think in general, a species on a whole has an average diet, but clearly, due to like the example I just gave, if that's accurate, which I think it is, there will be differences in making probably an optimal diet for individuals closer linked to sex and race and whatnot, even if it's not too far off. But my last question for Michael, and this mostly is in case we have a further conversation between the two of you, this part can get out of the way, because I think there was some question on how Michael takes anecdotal evidence. Michael, if you personally knew or just saw the stories of anecdotal stories of individuals, and let's say you happen to know a lot of people, so you were talking to like 1,000 people about their diets, and like 80% of them anecdotally were carnivore, and they were saying they were thriving, they looked like they were thriving, and then the 20% happened to be whole food plant-based, and you didn't know anybody that wasn't either of those. Or if it was the other way around, is there any number of anecdotal stories being told to you, let's say by people that you probably trust, that affect you, or do anecdotes not affect you when you look at this topic?
Yeah, I mean, they probably affect me a little bit. It's hard when you hear somebody's story about like recovering from horrible health conditions and improving their health. Like, it's great, the thing is, you don't know what it was about it that led to that outcome. It's like, as I said, it's if it's an elimination diet, maybe it was just removing a certain food that was harming you or whatever. But yeah, I mean, honestly, like, let's say I randomly went and talked to people walking by, and eventually I met 1,000 carnivores just randomly, and all of them were doing well. It's like, even if I didn't have a study, that would impact my, I probably would increase my credence that there might be something there. But what wouldn't affect my credence is going on like YouTube and looking at carnivore diets, or looking on like carnivore forums or something, because I don't think that's a good like representative random sample of people. I think that's like people who have motivated to be part of a community and whatever, and like there's going to be some where it's disproportionately bad, like carnivore cringe on Instagram, and there's some that are going to be disproportionately good, like pro carnivore groups. And I don't think that that's a good way of assessing like where the balance of anecdotes lead. Whereas if it's just randomly meeting people on the street, I would have higher credence in the anecdotes. But honestly, I would trust the data over the anecdotes. But when we don't have the data, I would like, that's sort of how I would respond to that anyway.
Okay. All right. Well, let's let Jackie get going. And I don't know about you two, but I thought that was great, and I hope we can do it again sometime. But yeah, you guys have a good one.
Thank you, Carson. Thank
Sounds
you,
good.
Michael.
Take
Carson,
care.
there's a few other questions. Did you want to continue on just a new stream
Yeah.
and just chat?
Yeah, that's fine.
Jackie,
All right,
welcome
Jackie.
to stay also if you want. But yeah, it was nice to meet you. Thanks for
Nice to
the
meet you.
discussion.
Yeah, thank you.
Do you want to
right.
end this stream and go on a new one just to keep the time down, or do you want to just continue here?
I'm not worried about the time. Yeah, we can continue. If you saw questions in here, and then after that, we can talk off the live as well. So,
Sure. Yeah, I wasn't really following it. Sorry, I usually try to follow the chat, but it was a lot for this one. One of the things I noticed was just somebody said something about brain size. That like when we started eating plants, our brain size went down. I would just say that like the size of brain has nothing to do with intelligence. It's like the number of neurons typically in the brain. So you can't just look at the size of somebody's head or brain and infer intelligence. I just wanted to say that. That's a lie, says Marcus. All right. Jeremy, what was Jeremy's thing about the drunk driver? I saw him say that, but I didn't read it.
it was at the very top. If you're able to scroll, I couldn't even paraphrase it, but it was just having a comparison to what she was
How long
saying.
were people randomly assigned to drive drunk versus so? Yeah, and that's just like a question about epistemic standards. So like, if how do we know that drunk driving causes car accidents? And it's like, what randomized control trial can you point to that looked at like randomly assigning people to drunk driving? But if we ask Jackie, would you accept that drunk driving causes accidents, at a higher rate or whatever? She'd probably say, yeah. I would assume she would say yes. Same thing with smoking. Like I probably should have asked her about smoking. We just got in other things. It's like, does smoking cause? Actually, if we look at like the relative risk for smoking is actually not that far off from like higher saturated fat. Like if you look at, for heart disease, if you look at like people that smoke like 1 to 2 cigarettes a day, the relative risk is something like 1.5. It might be even slightly lower. And if we look at like the saturated fat, some of the trials reducing saturated fat, it was like about half of that. But that's just like smoking. You're typically looking at like people who do not smoke versus people who smoke. And then if you're looking at saturated fat, you're looking at people who ate a little less of saturated fat versus people who ate a little more. So it's like, and you extrapolate that over a lifetime, it's like, it's a pretty similar comparison. So if you accept smoking and light smoking is causal in heart disease, it's not that far off to accept that, saturated fat is causal.
I did want to ask you, so I didn't ask too many questions. I told her in advance I wasn't going to ask many, and I was just going to essentially be here for this existing. I just saved my question for the end. But there were a couple times I thought to ask you a question. I just didn't want to. What do you think the odds are of that possibility that, say, the randomized controlled trials on middle-aged people, if those people grew up with a different diet, then the intervention would have a different outcome? Is there any reasonable possibility to that in your mind?
Well, I just don't see the relevance really, like, because we're talking about people who are already like at a certain age in their life and have grown up with eating whatever they ate and have whatever genetic history they have, same as the people in the trial. And the point is, like, if you take people and put them on an intervention, how does the risk change? And the risk goes down. And so it's like, so on average, it's like, if you extrapolate that out, it's like, yeah, maybe you're slightly different and maybe it doesn't go down in everyone. It goes up slightly in some and down a ton in others. But it's like on average, like at least in that study, the intervention led to lower risk. So it's like, I don't know, like, did that answer the question?
Yeah, it does. I just don't know. I always try to keep open to any possibilities, and it just makes me wonder if, like, in those given situations, although it's a lot of people and compared to others, like if in those situations they're in with being unhealthy already, if there is anything to the idea that this action could improve a thing, but it doesn't necessarily mean that would be like the better overall diet, that it's just affecting their situation. But
We
then
have,
again, I don't know if I fully understand the studies as well, because I'm not
yeah, and
great
that's
at
why like
that.
we need everything. We need more than just the RCTs. We need the long-term cohort data as well that looks at people over multiple decades. And I showed some of those, and looking at like quintiles of meat consumption, and others showing tendency to eating plant-based diets or eating more plants, eating more fiber. And if we look in the long term, it's like those just diet trends point to better health outcomes for more plants, better outcomes, more meat, worse outcomes. So it's like all of the data sort of stacks together and points in one direction extremely consistently. And that's like, I would take all of it into consideration, not just some. What's this Markin guy is really vocal. Does he want to come in and chat?
Yeah, you can definitely come in and chat if you want to. I have a feeling I know who it is. I could be wrong, but there's a guy that I've debated a couple times that I think has like 50,000 accounts.
He's saying that I advocate for sugar. I don't advocate for sugar. I don't know when I said that. He also says animal fat studies included highly processed meat as well. Like all of the studies I showed subgrouped out unprocessed meat. So like he's just wrong about that, unless I'm misinterpreting him or him, them, whoever it is. How am I a mindless puppet? Like, what do you? I don't know what.
I'm guessing it's. Yeah, I mean, I don't like to. I like to keep an open mind, so this person might be serious. But I'm assuming it's a troll of sorts. Whatever that means. But yeah, I would say if he wants to come on the stream, he's welcome to. And then outside of that, probably not worth looking at the comments.
Point of the Phil said earlier, the point of the studies is to cut through the anecdotes and other noise. This is one of the things where if we don't already agree, then I don't see how we will. I don't mean on diet, I mean on the study. Yeah. It's like if you don't connect the dots that that studies, the whole point is to give better, is to take all those random street conversations I had, factor out confounding variables. So it's like, now, like, what if those same 1,000 people I interviewed was actually 1 million people? So it's a bigger population. What if I looked at like other potential confounders? Like I tracked their BMI. I looked at how, like, whether they smoked or not, whether they drank alcohol. Like, to me, that seems way better than just like, taking the 1,000 conversations. Now I'm starting to factor in like potential confounders. And that's exactly what epidemiology is. It's looking at like large populations, doing our best to factor out potential known confounders, and then pool the data into or subgroup the data to show like risk level for certain dose responses even. Yeah. I'm still waiting for my check from Monsanto, Marcan. Is there anything else that sort of stood out during that discussion?
Not really. I was thinking. Oh, I was going to ask her, but I didn't. But I was going to ask her that if she was basing a diet just based on the information we have now from studies, if she would agree with you, and if the main disagreement is that she thinks that the best diet for humans potentially could be something that has not been studied, which is her claim, that the carnivore diet or even a whole food vegan diet, like neither have like been studied like well. It's just like the individual components have. So I was going to ask her that if she was going to go off of what has been thoroughly studied, would she agree with your take?
I tried to ask that, but I tried to ask that several times. That's when I was saying, like, because she said she formulated her belief based on like the stuff that I was talking about, right? And then I tried to say, like, so for that stuff, for the science nutrition stuff, do you think it leans one way or the other? And she was like, no, I'm agnostic on it all. I've seen some that points in the other direction, but like she didn't present any of it that went in the other direction. I love to talk about those ones.
Yeah.
And she said she had seen all that stuff before, but didn't give any reason why, like other than saying it's not properly controlled for, and she didn't understand what control meant in the context of an RCT. So I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. It's all pretty wild. One thing that I could see as reasonable for an individual is if you are going through something and then you try something for yourself and it works like a charm. It's really hard to convince yourself
Totally.
to start doing something else.
Totally.
So I respect that idea. But it definitely doesn't tell you anything about other individuals or the average human diet. And one thing that we can't really do, but we're getting closer with the studies we do, is if a zoo is going to have an animal like an elephant or whatever, how you decide what to feed them would be to look at their diet in nature. You just see, like, some eat, they can eat of 50 different plant species, but their favorite is this one. They thrive best on this one. And then you have this like average, even if there are some individual elephants that might have some unique thing where they do better on slightly different thing, you have this average thing. And so same thing where if some aliens were going to have a zoo full of humans, humans would do left to their own devices in nature, that being like the human species diet. You got to come to some kind of an answer, except we don't have humans that are just living in nature to figure that out. Although I guess that doesn't even answer everything, because what an animal tends to do and thrive on in nature wouldn't tell you what would be optimal if they had
Absolutely
everything at their, and
And you look
So-
at, like, because zoo animals who are fed their species appropriate diet or whatever, the carnivores have higher rates of heart disease.
yeah, interesting. Yeah.
Not that I'm saying that that's proof that it's bad for humans. Like, animals are different than humans or whatever. If they had lower rates of heart disease, I wouldn't say that's good evidence for my side. Even though, I'm just saying it's just interesting that the carnivorous zoo animals who are they have a longer life expectancy, so they're starting to hit those later in life health outcomes like heart disease, right? So it's the only reason we actually really see it there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. Well, this might be a good point to stop this one, unless you had any last thoughts.
No, I'll repeat, like Jeremy said this also in the chat. I'm just trying to find where he said it, but it sort of summed up my point. But basically just like, don't look at ancestral for what's good for long-term health, because what we evolutionarily adapt to is what helps us pass on our genes. And that doesn't matter once you're, in your 40s, basically. And when I say pass on your genes, I mean the full cycle of, like, some people say that you need to help your children pass on to, I'm talking about the full cycle of, like, propagating your genes through as many generations as the current research says. The point is, there's a window where the actions you take and all the things contributing to that increase your likelihood of passing on your genes. And then after that window is the thing I'm talking about later in life, where you're sort of outside of that window and it doesn't matter what you eat in terms of evolution.
Yeah. Gotcha. All right. Well, hopefully we'll set up another talk with her at some point, and then we got to set up another one with me and you on our own too. But everybody watching, thanks for watching, and we'll see you guys in the next one.
Ciao.